Sir Keir Starmer will overhaul the asylum appeal system in a bid to speed up the deportation of people with no right to be in the UK. Yvette Cooper promised to implement the new scheme amid protests about the use of hotel accommodation for migrants. The Home Secretary said completely unacceptable delays in the appeals process left failed asylum seekers in the system for years. There are about 51,000 asylum appeals waiting to be heard, taking on average more than a year to reach a decision. As measures have been put in place to speed up initial decisions, court delays over appeals are now thought to be the biggest cause of pressure in the asylum accommodation system. The government plans to set up a new independent panel focused on asylum appeals to help reduce the backlog. It will use professionally trained adjudicators, rather than relying on judges. Ministers are introducing a new 24-week deadline for the first-tier tribunal to determine asylum appeals by those receiving accommodation support and appeals by foreign offenders. But they believe the current tribunal system, which covers a wide range of different cases, is still failing to ensure failed asylum seekers can be returned as swiftly as possible, nor can it accommodate a fast-track system for safe countries. The government will set out further details of plans for asylum system reforms in the autumn, drawing on lessons from other European countries which have faster appeals systems, including some which run independent appeals bodies similar to the one being proposed. The Home Secretary said the overhaul would result in a system which is swift, fair, and independent, with high standards in place. She said, "We inherited an asylum system in complete chaos with a soaring backlog of asylum cases and a broken appeals system with thousands of people in the system for years on end. That is why we are taking practical steps to fix the foundations and restore control and order to the system." Ms. Cooper said that since the general election, the government has reduced the backlog of people waiting for initial decisions by 24% and increased failed asylum returns by 30%. She added, "But we cannot carry on with these completely unacceptable delays in appeals as a result of the system we have inherited, which mean that failed asylum seekers stay in the system for years on end at huge cost to the taxpayer." Official figures released earlier this month showed a total of 111,084 people applied for asylum in the UK in the year to June 2025, the highest number for any 12-month period since current records began in 2001. The record level of applications comes as the backlog of people waiting for an initial decision on their claims dropped to 90,812 at the end of June. There were 32,059 asylum seekers in UK hotels by the end of June. Labour has promised to end their use by 2029. As of August 20th, a total of 27,997 migrants had crossed the English Channel in small boats this year. This is up from 18,342 for the same period in 2024. Protests by groups opposed to the use of hotels and counter-demonstrations took place in towns and cities across the UK on Saturday. In Bristol, mounted police were brought in to separate rival groups in the Castle Park, and officers scuffled with protesters. Avon and Somerset police said no officer sustained serious physical injury or has required hospital treatment, but inquiries will be carried out after reports of assaults on them. In Horley, Surrey, about 200 anti-immigration protesters draped in St. George and Union flags clashed with roughly 50 stand-up to racism protesters. The two groups almost came together in the early afternoon, with lines of police separating them. The stand-up to racism protesters were shepherded into a smaller area as they continued to chant, "No hate, no fear, refugees are welcome here," which were met with "No the ref asterisk 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 not" from the other side of the street. On Tuesday, the High Court granted Epping Forest District Council a temporary injunction to remove asylum seekers from the Bell Hotel in Epping, Essex, from September 12th. The hotel had been a flashpoint for protests in recent weeks. The government announced plans on Friday to appeal against the High Court's refusal to allow it to intervene in the case and to further appeal against the temporary injunction. Other councils also publicly announced their intention to seek legal advice as to whether they could achieve a similar injunction for hotels in their areas. Reform UK's Nigel Farage has set out plans for mass deportations if he becomes Prime Minister. Arresting asylum seekers on arrival, automatic detention, and forced deportation to countries such as Afghanistan and Eritrea are among the proposals which will be set out in detail on Tuesday. They also include deals with third countries, which could include reviving the Conservatives' Rwanda scheme and sending asylum seekers to British overseas territories such as Ascension Island as a fallback option. Mr. Farage said the plans could see hundreds of thousands of people deported and 5 charter flights taking off from the UK every day. The first step of Reform UK's plans would be to leave the European Convention on Human Rights and to scrap the Human Rights Act, followed by legislation to bar those who come to the UK on small boats from claiming asylum. Next, standing beside the lectern at the Home Office, Yvette Cooper, the new Home Secretary, set out the government's response. Her language was blunt. "We inherited an asylum system in complete chaos with a soaring backlog of cases and a broken appeals system where thousands linger for years," she said. "That is why we are overhauling the process to make it swift, fair, and independent." The centerpiece of Labour's plan is a radical reform of asylum appeals. At present, roughly 51,000 appeals are waiting to be heard, with decisions often taking more than a year. Those delays not only fuel public frustration but also mean failed asylum seekers remain in taxpayer-funded accommodation, most often hotels, at a cost running into millions each week. Labour's solution is the creation of a new, independent asylum appeals panel staffed by trained adjudicators rather than judges. The panel will be tasked with clearing the backlog while working to a strict 24-week deadline for cases involving accommodation support or foreign offenders. Ministers insist this new model is inspired by faster systems on the continent, where countries like Germany and the Netherlands use specialist tribunals to process appeals within months, not years. Cooper hailed the proposal as a pragmatic fix. "We are drawing on the best European practice to build a system that is not only quicker but fairer." For Starmer, however, this is more than a technical reform. It is a political test of his authority. The new Prime Minister built his reputation on steady pragmatism. He repeatedly promised during the election campaign that Labour would take back control of Britain's borders without falling into what he called the gimmicks of the Conservatives. But critics are already accusing him of being too cautious, too reactive, and, above all, too slow. Reform UK, buoyed by its stunning electoral surge, has seized on the crisis to accuse Labour of betrayal. Nigel Farage, now leader of the opposition after Reform's shock general election gains, has unveiled his own hardline blueprint: immediate detention of all small boat arrivals, automatic rejection of asylum claims, and mass deportations to countries ranging from Afghanistan to Ascension Island. His plan also involves withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, an idea Labour has flatly rejected. Keir Starmer talks about fairness, but fairness for whom? Farage thundered at a reform rally in Birmingham. The taxpayer paying billions for hotels. Communities seeing their towns overwhelmed? We will deport, and we will do it fast. Reform's proposals are legally fraught and diplomatically combustible, but they resonate with a public increasingly anxious about the scale of migration. For Starmer, who has staked his leadership on rebuilding trust with voters in so-called red wall towns, the risk is obvious: lose control of the narrative, and reform could cement its new foothold. Beyond Westminster, tensions are already boiling over. In Bristol, mounted police were deployed in Castle Park after rival groups clashed during protests over the government's use of hotels for asylum seekers. Demonstrators chanting "refugees are welcome here" were drowned out by jeers of "send them back," while scuffles broke out on the fringes. Police later confirmed several officers were assaulted. In Horley, Surrey, the scene was even uglier. Around 200 anti-immigration protesters, draped in St. George's and Union flags, confronted a smaller group of stand-up-to-racism activists. The two sides were kept apart by a line of police officers, but not before ugly exchanges erupted. "No hate, no fear," chanted one side. "No there F*** not," came the response. These flashpoints are multiplying across the country. Councils, under pressure from residents, are turning to the courts to challenge the use of hotels. In Epping, Essex, the district council secured a temporary injunction to remove asylum seekers from the Bell Hotel. Other councils are now exploring similar legal moves, creating a patchwork of challenges to central government policy. The sheer scale of the crisis is daunting. 111,084 asylum applications were lodged in the 12 months to June 2025. 90,812 people were still awaiting an initial decision at the end of June, despite efforts to clear the backlog. 32,059 asylum seekers were housed in hotels at enormous cost. 27,997 migrants crossed the channel in small boats between January and August, up from 18,342 in 2024. These figures have shredded the government hope of presenting early progress. Yes, Labour claims to have reduced the initial decision backlog by 24% and increased failed asylum returns by 30% since July. But the headlines are dominated by the boat crossings and the record asylum applications. One Labour MP put it bluntly: You can talk about percentages until you're blue in the face, but if people see boats arriving in record numbers, they think we're failing. Labor's allies argue that the new appeals system is not a desperate measure, but a long overdue structural reform. Officials point to countries like Sweden, where asylum appeals are dealt with by dedicated migration courts that specialize in such cases, allowing for both speed and expertise. The government has also studied France's fast-track system, where claims from safe countries are handled within weeks. Ministers insist the UK must develop its own model, but they are open about drawing on lessons from abroad. The risk, however, is that importing foreign models may clash with Britain's unique legal and political landscape. You can't just cut and paste from Europe, warns one former immigration judge. Our courts, our human rights framework, our political culture, it's all different. For all the detail, the asylum appeals overhaul is, at heart, a gamble. That speeding up decisions will restore faith in the system, reduce the need for hotels, and blunt reforms at tax. But Starmer faces a perilous balancing act. Crack down too hard, and he risks alienating Labor's progressive wing, already uneasy at rhetoric about deportations. Go too soft, and he hands Nigel Farage an open goal. The stakes are high. Starmer has staked his premiership on proving Labour can be trusted with issues of law, order, and borders, areas where the Conservatives once enjoyed unassailable leads. If he fails, Reform UK could transform from a protest party into a permanent force. Lost amid the political point scoring are the lives of the asylum seekers themselves. Many fled war zones, persecution, or desperate poverty. Among them are families who risked their lives crossing the Channel, children who know nothing but limbo in British hotels, and individuals who may ultimately have their claims rejected but cannot be deported to unsafe countries. Charities warn that the backlog has devastating human consequences. We are talking about people trapped in indefinite uncertainty, says Inder Solomon, chief executive of the Refugee Council. Children growing up in hotel rooms, young people unable to work, trauma compounding trauma. For these voices, the debate is not about numbers or politics, but about dignity and humanity. Yet in the heated climate of 2025, theirs is a quieter voice, easily drowned out by slogans and street clashes. The government insists its reforms will be fully outlined in the autumn. Officials are drafting legislation to establish the Independent Appeals Panel and setting targets for reducing the hotel population. Labour has also reiterated its pledge to end the use of hotels entirely by 2029, replacing them with purpose-built reception centers. But opponents are not waiting. Reform UK is preparing to publish its full deportation plan, with Farage promising 5 charter flights a day to remove asylum seekers. The Conservatives, weakened but still vocal, accuse Labour of reinventing the wheel and claim their own Rwanda scheme would have worked if given time. Councils continue to seek injunctions. Meanwhile, the boats keep coming. Each dinghy that lands on the Kent coast brings not only human stories of desperation but also fresh political pressure. For Starmer, the fear is simple, that images of arrivals will define his early premiership, just as Stop the Boats defined Rishi Sunak's. The migration crisis of 2025 has become the first great test of Keir Starmer's government. His overhaul of the asylum appeals system may yet prove decisive in breaking the logjam that has plagued successive administrations. But for now, the sense is one of firefighting, of a prime minister reacting to events rather than shaping them. The stakes could not be higher. If Labour cannot convince the public it has control, the record levels of asylum applications and boat crossings risk leaving its promises in tatters, and Keir Starmer's grip on power weaker than he could ever have imagined so soon after victory.